Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Riley Walters. I'm Deputy Director of the Japan Chair here at Hudson Institute. Today, we're joined by a great panel to talk about strengthening Taiwan's trade and economic security. I think there's no doubt that Taiwan is an important partner for the United States, and I think a lot in Washington have come to learn this as well, given all the discussions there are in town about the importance of the semiconductor supply chain security, supporting Taiwan's thriving democracy, the growing coercion that we see from mainland China. And so today we've got a great panel to talk about a very specific topic, and that is the economic and trade relationship between the United States and Taiwan. Taiwan is actually one of America's largest trading partners for goods. Again, as I already mentioned, it is an essential partner in the semiconductor supply chain, and there have been some large Taiwanese semiconductor companies making large announcements in the United States over the last few years. But to talk about this issue, I've brought in a special group. Let me just kind of run through their introductions real quick, and then we'll get into our panel discussion. Up first is Abby Hu. She is a research fellow here at the Hudson Institute and a former senior analyst with Econ One Research. And next to her is Rupert Hammond Chambers, president of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council and managing director for Taiwan at the Bauer Group Asia. Finally, we have Wendy Cutler, vice president of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and actually a former trade negotiator for the United States with a lot of our partners in Asia. So with that, I'm going to let Abby speak first, and then we'll move on from there. Abby?
Thank you so much for that introduction, Riley. I'm very excited for this discussion with Rupert and Wendy. I guess as the first speaker, I'm going to start off in a very broad, general meaning of what this trade initiative mean for U.S. and Taiwan, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and drawing a lot of parallels to cross-strait relations, China's aggressive actions following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, as well as the proposed Taiwan Policy Act. I feel like a lot of the discussion is centered around how the U.S. can support Taiwan in terms of military arms sales or defense and symbolic political assurances. Well, all of these aspects are very important for Taiwan and for the U.S. to signal that it would not back down easily to Chinese pressure. In my opinion, straightening trade and economic ties are very important to supporting Taiwan as well. And as Riley had mentioned before, Taiwan is a very important trading partner to the U.S., but the U.S. is actually Taiwan's second largest trading partner at $114 billion of trade flows last year. However, in comparison, Taiwan's trade flows with China was actually $273 billion US dollars. So that was a little over double the amount of that with the U.S. And so with that being said, Taiwan is heavily dependent on China when it comes to trade, and this has always been hard for Taiwan to balance between this very real economic dependency, but also military threat from China. And with that being said, even though Taiwan has taken steps to diversify its trading partners with the new southbound policy and having Taiwanese firms reshore from China back to Taiwan, it has still been challenging for Taiwan to participate in multilateral economic frameworks and strengthening economic ties with other countries that are fearful of closer ties with Taiwan and fear of Chinese retaliation. And so with all of that context in mind, I think having a closer trade cooperation between the US and Taiwan is very crucial for Taiwan to balance out this economic dependency on China. And I'm sure we'll get into the details of the trade initiative in just a moment, but in these 11 trade areas of the initiative, I feel like the digital trade aspect is something that is going to be very important moving forward. And it would be very interesting to see what kind of rules and standards on data flows, data privacy, and usage across borders that US and Taiwan might potentially touch upon under this new initiative.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I forgot to mention on the onset actually about the 21st century trade. That's okay. It's a new initiative, of course, between the United States and Taiwan that was announced earlier this year, right around the same time that the United States announced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I think you make a good point. I think there's a lot of interest in particularly the digital chapter, what could come out as a digital agreement. Not just for the US and Taiwan, but also within IPEF. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A portion. But before that, I'm going to pass it over to Rupert. The floor is yours.
Riley, thank you very much indeed for including me this morning. I'm going to play a little bit on Abby's excellent comments. I too experience US, Taiwan, China trade in a dynamic period at the moment with a good number of cross currents. What I'd like to frame, as Abby did, the tensions in the Taiwan Strait, over the last few years, of course, but most recently post Mrs. Pelosi's trip, as to how we've been experiencing them here in the States. A very binary discussion between peace and war, which I believe is misleading in respect to China's actual overall strategy as it relates to Taiwan, and the CCP's efforts to absorb Taiwan into the People's Republic of China. I would suggest to you and your audience that what the Chinese, a big part of the Chinese strategy at the moment is economic coercion. That what they're in essence attempting to do is to create this view that Taiwan is a dangerous place to do business. And in so doing, to create the impression pushed into the international business community at a sovereign level, country to country, as well as a corporate level, that the risk of doing business in Taiwan is rising, and the literal cost of doing business in Taiwan is rising. And the greater pressure that the Chinese can place on Taiwan at this juncture, the greater economic coercion that it can apply, and the more it can deter future investment, not what's happened in the past, not what's happening right now, but future investment. We're not talking weeks, months, we're talking years into the future. The more they can curb the upward economic trajectory of Taiwan while putting themselves forward as the only real option for the Taiwan economy's long-term future. Of course, in so doing, their belief is that economic bind that Abby touched on in respect to China being Taiwan's top trading partner, although I suspect, Abby, a lot of that trade with China is then ending up being exported, and a good bit of it's probably ending up here in the States, among other markets. But nevertheless, that the overall effort here with the Chinese is to economically coerce Taiwan, to weaken it economically and put it in a more vulnerable position. So it really creates, as Abby superbly noted, it really creates, well, what do we do about it? What's in America's national interest? Well, our national interest is to ensure that our economic trading partners are as vital and as important to us in respect to the exchange of intellectual property, the manufacturing of intellectual property, and a market for our goods and services as is possible. Taiwan is a monster for us, top 10 trading partner in the world. Taiwan's economic marginalization is an economic issue for us at a national security level, separate of the sort of binary point that I was making about peace and war and the kinetic challenges of a potential blockade or even, God forbid, a war in the Taiwan Strait. So the United States can and should position itself to engage Taiwan economically in a more significant way than it already is. Well, we have 4 economic platforms at the moment up and running. It is good news. Back in 2016, we had one, TIFA. We were about to go into a period under Mr. Lighthizer and the presidency of Donald Trump, where we didn't do a trade and investment framework agreement at all, as Mr. Lighthizer focused on China, regrettably, to the detriment of American national interest with Taiwan economically. But what did happen, in fairness, during the Trump administration, was we got a couple of new trade platforms. State and commerce sought to try and fill the void that USTR had created with the EPPD and the TTIC. Your viewers can look those up for themselves. And now, of course, we have the Biden administration's US-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade, a reflection of the IPEF that is up and running regionally. But overall, while these are useful, only TIFA is one that can actually handle trade liberalization in areas that are critical for us, like investment, tax, agriculture. The others are all sort of forward-looking standards and other things, sort of the direction that we want to take, regulations and things are useful, but let's not call breadcrumbs a feast. What we really need out of the United States from Republicans and Democrats is a cohesive trade agenda that we can take to our friends and allies. And in this instance, of course, Taiwan, that can liberalize both economies and increase provide increased trade flows between the two. Taiwan can and should be an excellent opportunity for the executive branch and the congressional branches to come together and hammer something out, because there's such strong bipartisan support for Taiwan, because there's such strong recognition. But again, as Abby pointed out, we defer far too much to the military side, the political military side, and we don't pay enough attention to the economic side. So my hope for and the leadership we can expect while we're seeing US-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade, Wang Meihua, the economic minister, is here in town this week for TTIC negotiations and engagement with the Commerce Department. Super, all welcome. But we really need something more substantial, and we need that leadership to come from the White House and Congress. If I may, just to cover two other quick points. While that's all incumbent on us, US policy matters here as well. And I would certainly argue that export controls are an excellent way of curbing some of the more predatory industries that the Chinese are pursuing at the moment, particularly semiconductors. And last Friday, we had from the Biden administration, I think mostly some welcome news about increased export control, and what I hope will be some balance between US economic interest, but also looking at the semiconductor industry as a way to press China on intellectual property and trade secrets, to curb some of its predatory industries, and also to ensure that the technologies that it may be stealing or it may be developing on the back of American technology is not being used by businesses that can then turn around and undermine US national interest. I think we've got to get that balance right, because Taiwan companies can get caught up in that. But your viewers will have seen how Taiwan semiconductor stocks responded overnight in response to that. I'd also flag for your viewers a Wall Street Journal editorial today by former Secretary of State Pompeo, in which he frames the stakes for the new industrial policy in the semiconductor space, and also the importance of increased investment and better balance between the US and Taiwan. And we obviously have to pay strong attention to that too. Thanks, Riley.
No, thank you, Rupert. Yeah, I think we've been on the same panel a few times over the last few years, talking about the importance of the almost necessity for something more concrete between the United States and Taiwan. And I like to think that we were talking about it before it kind of became in vogue most recently. So up next, Wendy, I don't know if you have any, well, I'll pass it to you for your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. This has been an interesting conversation. My sense is, well, first of all, I think Abby and Rupert have done a great job in underscoring the importance of strengthening our economic and trade ties with Taiwan. And, I think that is the consensus in Washington. That's the trajectory we need to be on. I think where there is disagreement, however, is what's the best mechanism to achieve that. Rupert mentioned, I think, 4 ongoing dialogues. If you count other fora where Taiwan's involved, I think that number would go up even further. But my sense is that Rupert and maybe Riley, without using the word free trade agreement, are kind of hinting that that's where we should be headed. I'm going to take issue with that. I'm a big proponent of this 21st century trade initiative announced by USTR a few months ago. The reason why I am is that I don't think I disagree with Rupert. I don't consider it breadcrumbs. I consider it to be like a hearty breakfast. I don't think it's everything, but I think it's a really good start and further than we've gone with Taiwan in the past. And I would argue it's a much better platform for strengthening our trade ties than TIFA. Under this initiative, there's some overlap with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework matters. And I think the US and Taiwan have an incredible opportunity to move quickly on those IPEF items and almost show the way forward for the other participants of IPEF. In addition, there are topics including non-market economies and state-owned enterprises that are on this 21st Century Trade Initiative agenda, but not on IPEF. And so I think progress can be made in those areas as well. I couldn't agree more with Rupert that trade coercion is a critical issue that we shouldn't just be addressing bilaterally with Taiwan, but countries around the world. We really need to band together to counter economic coercion more broadly, and to help those countries and economies that are subject to economic coercion. And that can be subject of a different discussion. So my view is start with the 21st Century Initiative, US and Taiwan, roll up your sleeves, come up with significant, robust outcomes. And at that point, maybe then further discussions can happen about how to go further. Let's move to lunch and dinner in our relationship. I would just conclude by saying, as the only one on the panel, I think, that has negotiated free trade agreements. They are not easy negotiations. Even with your closest partner that you think there's no space between your positions, they are very detailed. They get into very sensitive areas in the other economies, including agriculture, which is very sensitive for Taiwan. And so my view would be, if and when there is a consensus to move forward on an FTA track, let's make sure we do the proper preparatory work with Taiwan so that there are no surprises and that the FTA doesn't actually create tension between the United States and Taiwan, but actually bring us closer together.
Great point. Great points. I've got actually so many questions, and I'm trying to think of the best way to begin asking them. I think the first question I'll ask is, there's, how do I say this, time limits on certain things, certain initiatives. The Biden administration may really only be here for another 2 years. The Tsai administration is only going to be in office for really another 2 years. Is that enough time to get something done, whether it's 21st century trade? Rupert, you mentioned the TTIC, the Trade and Technology Investment Council, which honestly, I think it was launched a year ago. And so I think this will be their first discussions. And is there enough time to get anything really moving on some of these issues? I don't know who would like to take that first, but I honestly address that for everyone.
I do think there's a challenge that we're facing with forgive me, Wendy, I'm going to stick with 4 for the purposes of simplicity, but I don't disagree with your point that there are others as well. But I do think we are running up against a challenge that I think that certainly on the Taiwan side, I know that they grasp is that these 4 different, there's quite a lot of overlap with these 4 different platforms, and it's not quite clear yet how they're all, which one's in the ascendancy and which one isn't. Every platform wants a bite of the semiconductor apple. So how's that going to work? Who's actually going to drive that forward? Is there going to be some interagency process that works out who does what? And then in Taiwan, we also have, at least a 2-headed hydra on trade engagement. We've got John Dong, the minister without portfolio, who's also head of the Office of Trade Negotiation. But we also have Wang Meihua, the Minister of Economic Affairs, who's here to do the TTIC negotiation with the Department of Commerce. So I do think that there's some work to do sorting out which of these platforms is going to handle which of these issues, as there is some overlap and then how the interagency process will work in both governments to ensure that there's good coordination. Wendy would probably, as Wendy noted, she's done negotiations before successfully. Perhaps she can touch a wee bit on how that interagency process can or cannot work. But that's one thing I'd flag for you.
I would add, I think prioritization is just critical, that there are a lot of initiatives. I think both governments have to agree on which initiative requires the most resources and senior level attention. I would argue right now, the 21st Century Trade Initiative coupled with semiconductor work would present a robust agenda. I agree with you, Riley. Time is not on the side of any of these discussions, but I would argue they could move quickly if indeed there's a political will and top-down guidance from both governments to move quickly and to produce outcomes. I'm also a little less worried about the time element because I think when it comes to US-Taiwan trade, I sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, strong bipartisan support, at least in the United States. I defer to others on the mood in Taiwan, but my sense is that, in both economies, there is a strong desire to strengthen these economic and trade ties.
Absolutely. Yeah, I get the sense that it's growing increasingly bipartisan as well. And really, it's a combination of the economics of it, but also the security and the diplomacy of it. It's all sort of coming together. And honestly, they might be fortifying one another, strengthening one another. I don't know, Abby, if you had any thoughts on this question on timing.
Yeah, so I think back to Wendy's point, obviously a lot of people in both the US and Taiwan are hoping for a free trade agreement, but as Wendy noted, these agreements take time, they're very detailed, and I realistically don't think that this is something that is achievable within the short window of time that we have. And I think that is why I'm more of the camp of being optimistic about this US-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade, because I think there is a lot that could be done in the short time frame that we have, if you will, between the Biden administration and Tsai administration to go over things that are not maybe market access or lowering tariffs, but can be very substantial in terms of lowering trade barriers and strengthening these economic ties.
And if I can just add that if you look at the different topics under the 21st Century Initiative, a number of them come straight out of our free trade agreements. So in some ways, it could provide a basis for moving towards an FTA again, if there was, if such a decision was reached between Congress and the executive branch. It's not like one or the other. I take Rupert's point and what Abby just mentioned. Yes, tariff cuts aren't on the table, but when you look at free trade agreements, there's a chapter on digital trade. There's a chapter on good regulatory practices. There's a chapter on customs and trade facilitation. So in some ways, the 21st Century Initiative, it's not in conflict with an FTA. One could argue it could provide a basis for moving forward if and when both economies think the time is right.
There's definitely, I think, a good debate to be had in Washington on the sort of what should be included, what shouldn't be included, sort of as we progress towards greater economic integration. We've been talking about TIFAs for 30 years now, and the hopes that would lead to a bilateral trade agreement. And now I think there's a lot of hope that, as you were saying, the 21st century trade could lead to significant agreements, maybe not all of them necessarily just yet getting up to the level of a bilateral trade agreement. I want to go back to something that Rupert, you said earlier, which I think is an interesting point. You were talking about the Chinese talking point that Taiwan is a dangerous place to invest. That's sort of their talking point, but that's also, I think, a talking point we actually hear a lot in Washington. I think it's actually one of the main talking points used by this administration, the Biden administration, for why we shouldn't have semiconductor investment in Taiwan, but instead in the United States. And so how do we deal with this almost, I think, competing rhetoric? Because we do want to support Taiwan. We do want greater US-Taiwan integration, economic integration, so that we can support their economy, so that they cannot become a victim of economic coercion. But at the same time, we also want to, we're also talking about the dangers of having our investments over there. And so, Rupert, how do we sort of square this circle?
Yeah, thanks, Riley. I really do like this subject, and at the tail end of my opening remarks, I flagged a piece that Pompeo has in the Journal today, where he talks about neo-industrial policy here in the States. I think first and foremost, it's getting the investment balance right. What are Taiwan's critical areas of strength? We're pursuing a neo-industrial policy on semiconductors. Let's stick for that. It's as good a space as any. And we want to ensure that Taiwan is a hugely significant part of that. It's not just about production down in Phoenix, Arizona. What's going to happen with the balance in R&D? Are we going to be able to ensure that research and development also is done in the United States as it's done in Taiwan? We can actually structure this in a way in which the ties that bind our two economies together are strengthened, not weakened. There's no getting away from the fact that the military side's fortifying Taiwan's military strength as an act of deterrence towards the PLA is an effective way, and not but an effective way of a broader strategy to reduce tensions in the Taiwan Strait, and by extension then push back on the Chinese efforts to create this view. But I'm going to sound like a stuck record here. The best thing that can happen is countries engaging Taiwan at a sovereign level in bilateral trade agreements, because what the country is doing is it's signaling to the rest of the world, and there's no country more important economically than the United States. I don't think that's hubris. I believe that with every fiber of my being. We are the most important economy. When we do things like this, it signals to the rest of the world that we have faith in the long term in the economic health and well-being of Taiwan, and that we're going to deploy capital there and encourage our companies and incentivize our companies to do the same thing. And that leadership can and should have an impact on how Japan, a trading bloc like the EU, the Aussies, and others consider it too.
I agree on that. I think Taiwan almost needs American support in a lot of these efforts. I mean, the Japanese are very supportive of Taiwan, but at a trade event I was moderating last week, one of the points that was made was that Taiwan's ascension into CPTPP, the mega Trans-Pacific trade bloc, is really uncertain without the United States being there. Japan is supportive of Taiwan joining, but without the United States being a member, it's really up in the air. This actually, I think this conversation ties into something that Abby, you wrote recently about Taiwan's energy security. I think it's almost a specific conversation on this issue. Taiwan itself is looking to build economic resiliency, and we still, I think, have some different definitions of what that can mean, but Taiwan is very reliant on import energy, but at the same time they've got the PLA doing daily activities around their island, which increases the chance of something bad going on. So something bad happening. So Abby, I don't know if you had any thoughts about your excellent recent piece on this and how it ties into this conversation.
Yes, thank you, Riley. So yes, to your point, Taiwan imports 98% of its energy supply. And so when we're looking at the crisis in Ukraine and debating on what the energy dependency of European countries on Russia is. You look at Taiwan, even though our energy imports are not directly related to just China alone, Taiwan does import its energy from Australia, US, and Qatar, but the dependency on export for energy obviously is tied into everything, electricity, its semiconductor industry. And so in the event of an embargo imposed by China, it would be very difficult for Taiwan, as was brought up recently in August, following Speaker Pelosi's visit. There's been the question of how much reserves that Taiwan has, and I believe in terms of liquefied natural gas, it was 10 to 11 days, which is very small number of reserves compared to what a prolonged conflict with China may be. And so one of the points that senior fellow Thomas Dusterberg and I were trying to make in the piece is that the US could also be doing more in terms of supporting Taiwan in the energy front to ensure that it has a steady supply of, for example, LNG, as US is one of the top exporters of, and Taiwan in its energy goals aim to have LNG generate 50% of electricity, with 30% being coal and 20% being renewables. And so in this current situation of going towards that goal, I think there is a lot that the US can do to ensure that Taiwan meets its energy policy goals, but also have a steady supply of LNG in the case of potential conflict.
The energy makeup, I think, of any economy, especially an island, is very interesting to watch. Japan's very similar in this regard, and it's interesting to think about the importance of diversification, diversifying energy supply. And of course, I think the United States is an excellent partner in this. That kind of leads into this question I have for you, Wendy, is the real, how do I say this? The real, real life takeaways from trade negotiations. And so, one of the things that people talk about in Washington is making trade negotiations not just understandable for the common day, for people who aren't trade negotiators, but also, talking about ways that trade really benefits the local American economy, whether it's exporting LNG or exporting farm goods, all of Taiwan. What's your experience in this regard? How do you message the benefits of trade, particularly with Taiwan?
Well, that's a great question. And I worked for several administrations, both Republican and Democratic, that thought that they could really lead this debate and kind of turn public opinion around. It is a really hard debate to prevail in. There are definitely benefits of trade. And I know the business community has made a big effort to show how it's not just big businesses, but it's small businesses. It's the workers, it's the minorities that work in the small businesses. All of these points have been made. But at the end of the day, let's just be honest, the folks who are kind of left behind, who are not benefiting from these agreements, are more vocal and tend to get a lot more attention. And frankly, we haven't had domestic policies in place to help them with their adjustment and help them face the challenges that they've faced. And this, let's just be honest, this has led to this worker-centered trade policy pursued by the Biden administration, which has put market access, kind of put it aside, right? Trying to focus on other issues. And I notice even in the 21st Century Initiative, one of the 11 pillars between the US and Taiwan is working on, worker-centered trade policy. So there's a real effort to make this a notable feature in trade initiatives going forward. It is a challenge. I think the question that we were discussing earlier, on one hand, we want to bring back a lot of investment and manufacturing jobs to the United States through reshoring. On the other hand, we want to work with our allies and partners. And there is some kind of conflict between all of this. It's not smooth sailing. And this is something that the Biden administration is going to have to kind of navigate through, because in my view, you kind of can't have it both ways. You can't just have your allies and partners when you want them to help you with those supply chains that are of interest to you, while at the same time, you're discriminating against them in your own market. So lots of challenges. I don't think any of them are insurmountable, but I do think that this underscores that the kinds of challenges on the trade front now are very different, I would even argue, than the challenges we faced when we concluded TPP in 2015. And so for me, when I look at the agenda of this 21st century trade initiative, I think that's kind of where the action is. But I don't discount the importance of also including tariff cuts or market access commitments. I don't think one precludes the other. One can take more prominence, but I don't think it should be an either-or situation, either in this bilateral initiative or, frankly, in the IPEF either.
I would say that for the United States and Taiwan, there are particular industries that have relatively high tariff rates, and that's certainly important. But I think longstanding commitments are what keeps people interested. Rupert, you could probably correct me on this. Businesses want to see commitments, long-term commitments, and that means putting pen to paper at the end of the day. But I would also say, one of the things I think that maybe this administration is lacking on when they're thinking about Taiwan, and this is kind of going to an earlier point, is helping Taiwan in the international space. The United States does have this Indo-Pacific economic framework that we do have negotiations with 7 ASEAN countries, 5 major economies in Northeast Asia, Australia, Fiji, but Taiwan was left out for political reasons or geopolitical reasons, whatever you would like to call it. It's not necessarily helping Taiwan, and so it's almost like dual tracks. I understand sometimes that's the nature of this is the way administrations think when they are dealing with Taiwan, but I don't think it's necessarily the right path all the time. And so finding that right balance, I think, is important. I'm going to ask if any of you would like to have final comments before we close out for today. And we'll just go the same way that we gave our comments at the beginning. Abby, if you have any additional thoughts.
Right. So just to kind of echo what you had talked about, Riley, I think not just for the US, but really for any other countries when they're dealing with Taiwan, they tend to want that dual track of separating out Taiwan so that they won't make China retaliate for including Taiwan, for example, in the IPEF. But I think that this is not really a sustainable method of dealing with Taiwan. That is just leading to Taiwan being continuously isolated from these multilateral economic frameworks and organizations. And so it really does take like-minded allies and partners to advocate for Taiwan on their behalf to join. And to be very honest, engaging in Taiwan in any way would make China angry. And so really figuring out which method is worth taking that risk and would lead to substantial gains in ties with Taiwan and strengthening Taiwan's relations with the world is worth thinking about. Thank you.
No, thank you. Rupert?
Riley, I like a theme that Wendy was striking through her comments. We have a wonderful former colleague who's retired now, although I don't think he ever really will retire, Rick Ruzicka, who was at USTR for many years and then at the American Institute in Taiwan, just down the hallway from where I'm sitting. And Rick talked about building blocks, that we have to recognize where we are in domestic political reality and take what we can get to build towards something more prominently. And I'm not conceding to Wendy in the sense that I think she and I are disagreeing. I think I'm just noting that what Wendy's advocating is the political reality of where we are right now. And I do think that's enormously important. The other point I'd like to wrap up with is clearly the Biden administration, the Japanese, the Australians, Britain, and some within the European Union are injecting heightened urgency in respect to Chinese attitudes towards Taiwan on the military front. We are clearly moving into a new phase of urgency in that area. If your viewers are willing to accept the point I'm making about economic coercion toward Taiwan as part and parcel of the Chinese strategy, I would argue that sense of urgency that is rightly placed in the defense space and the security space should also be placed in the economic space. And while economic liberalization has often felt like a barge going through the Suez Canal slowly and painfully, that we are actually, it's incumbent on us to inject more urgency into this matter. If in fact we believe, which I think is true, that the security situation deserves urgency, so does the economic relationship.
Excellent point. Wendy, I'll give you the final word.
I think Taiwan and the United States have an enormous opportunity under this 21st century initiative, both to move quickly and move robustly and produce outcomes. I think that work can help shape IPEF, even if Taiwan's not part of IPEF. And I think it could really strengthen our economic and trade relationship. And again, offer an opportunity maybe to take it even further. And if we want to look for one area where we should be stepping up our work with our allies and partners, that's the area of economic coercion that Rupert has mentioned. We saw after Speaker Pelosi's trip, China take a number of steps to block Taiwan food exports, as well as to block sand exports. And I think we're going to be seeing more and more steps that smack of economic coercion. Taiwan's not alone here. Other countries, including Lithuania, Korea, Philippines, have been subject to this type of economic coercion. And for me, when I look at what's on the economic agenda going forward, this is an area that I just think, if left unchecked, really can endanger kind of the rules-based trading system.
Absolutely. And I expect, the issue of economic coercion to increase as well. I mean, after the Chinese Party Congress, I don't think things are going to settle down, but, maybe we can hope, we can hope they will. Anyways, thank you all for joining me today. I think this was a wonderful discussion talking about the importance of the US-Taiwan economic relationship and the ways that we can really build a more robust, secure relationship. Again, thank you all, and thank you all for joining us today at Hudson Institute. I look forward to seeing you next time.